Hi, this is lesson 2.6, dividing real numbers. You should be on page 103. Let's talk about the word reciprocals first. I know you've heard this word before. Reciprocals basically mean, this is not a math teacher way of speaking it, but taking a number and flipping it. So if you take the reciprocal of 2/3 and you flip that, it'd be 3/2. Those are reciprocals of each other. Reciprocals always multiply out to 1. You can see that example here. 2/3 and 3/2, those are reciprocals. They multiply out to 1. There is another word that we can associate with reciprocals because they basically mean the same thing. Reciprocals and multiplicative inverse are essentially saying the same thing. Multiplicative inverse is saying the number that I get after the flipping, like the multiplicative inverse of 2/3 would be 3/2. So when I read this term, multiplicative inverse, I normally just in my mind think, okay, I'm talking about reciprocals. Okay? There is a concept with reciprocals that we should know, or a fact. Whenever you multiply reciprocals together, you get 1. This verbiage here, the product of a non-zero number and its multiplicative inverse is 1. That sounds kind of complicated. I just wrote this. Another way of saying this would be the following. When you multiply reciprocals together, you always get 1. That's a rule that you ought to know. Whenever I multiply reciprocals together, it's called the inverse property of multiplication, I get 1. Okay? Now, this lesson's on division. What does that reciprocal stuff have to do with division? Well, think about 6 divided by 3. I think everybody in here, as they're watching, 6 divided by 3 is 2. If you take 6 times 1/3, you notice 1/3 is the reciprocal of 3. That equals 2 also. You can conclude that dividing by 3 is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal, which is 1/3, which gets us to the division rule. And kind of like the addition rules we learned and the subtraction rules we learned, if you don't understand the division rule, it's going to cause you headaches when you have to do problems without a calculator. This is a rule. Maybe I'll put a little red star by it. You definitely want to know. You definitely need to know, and you definitely need to apply, okay? The division rule, it says to divide a number A by a non-zero number B, multiply A by the multiplicative inverse of B. In other words, for division problems, you should multiply by the reciprocal. That's what this rule is telling you. We're going to practice this rule right now. Let's try. For a problem like 5, I probably wouldn't use the rule because 64 divided by 4, by the way, the rules for the signs are the same as multiplication. We'll talk about that in a minute. We have 2 positives in the problem. That's an even amount. I know, or 2 negatives in the problem. That's an even amount, so I know my answer is positive. If I have an even number of negatives in my problem, when I multiply or divide, I get a positive answer. So this is positive. I already know off the top of my head 64 divided by 4 is 16. So number 5, I know the answer is 16. Okay, let me write that down. But the rule is important for problems like this. Okay, this problem, I teach this stuff. I don't know how to do this in my head as a division, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to rewrite the problem as -3/8 times 10 over 3. I'm multiplying by the reciprocal. I know my answer is negative because there's 1 negative in the problem. Do you see how the 3's cancel and give me 1's? And I can definitely divide 8 and 10 by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. Do you see how I have 1 times 5 over 4 times 1? My answer is -5/4. There wasn't any hard math there, but I used the division rule. If I didn't use the division rule, this problem might have been impossible to do. Okay? Let's try 7. I'm not going to do 18 divided by negative 2/9. I'm going to do 18 over 1 times negative 9 over 2. I'm multiplying by the reciprocal. I have one negative in the problem. That's an odd amount, so my answer is negative. And then this is kind of slick. Look at 2 goes into itself once. 2 goes into 18 9 times. This problem is nothing more than 9 times 9, which is 81. My answer is negative 81. Or 8. I'm not going to do negative 2/5 divided by 18. I'm going to do negative 2/5, and I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal of 18, which is 1 over 18. So I know my answer is negative. There's only one negative in the problem. 2 can be divided by 2 once. 2 can be divided, or 18 can be divided by 2 9 times. I get 1 times 1 on top and 5 times 9 on the bottom. My answer is negative 1/45. We're not doing any hard mental math here if you apply the division rule. Let's quickly look at the multiplicative inverses too. Remember, this term means reciprocal. I want to write the reciprocals of each of these. These should be a piece of cake. Number 1, if I take the reciprocal, I get negative 1 over 27. I just flip the number over. Number 2, I just flip it over. I ought to get negative 1 over 8. Number 3, I flip the number over. I ought to get negative 7 over 4. And number 4, I flip the number over. I ought to get negative 3 over 1, which I'm just going to write as negative 3. I mean, there should be little thinking on finding the multiplicative inverse. You're just flipping the number over. Now, I've already addressed this a little bit earlier now, the sign of the quotient. Remember, quotient means division. So this is saying the sign of a division. They give you some rules. I'm just going to say the same thing I did with multiplication. If you have an even number of negatives in your problem, even amount of negatives, your answer has to be positive when you're dividing. If you have an odd amount of negatives in your division problem, your answer has to be a negative answer. It's the exact, look at, they even say here, the sign rules for division are the same as the sign rules for multiplication. It's the exact same thing I told you back in lesson 2-4. Okay? Dividing real numbers. So here would be one more example of what we talked about. Look at what they do here. Instead of dividing, they multiply by the reciprocal. Let me write one more step here. So they're doing negative 20 over 1 times negative 3 over 5. Does it make sense why the answer is positive? Because we have two negatives, an even amount. And then look at this. 5 goes into itself once. 5 goes into 24 times. Can you see where we're getting 4 times 3 is 12 and 1 times 1 is 1? We're getting 12 over 1, which is 12. Okay? Last, you're going to have some work problems that are going to ask you to find the mean. So we need to know what mean is. And no, mean doesn't mean punch the person next to you in the nose. That's not the kind of mean I'm talking about. In algebra, the word mean stands for average. When they ask you to find the mean, they want you to find the average. So in this problem, when they're asking you to find the mean, the daily mean temperature right here, let me underline that, the daily mean, okay? What they're asking me to do is calculate the average of these 5 temperatures. So to calculate average, remember, I'm going to take these 5, I'm going to add them up, and I'm going to divide by 5. Now, if you put this in your calculator, which some of you might do, because I'm sure in the homework, this would not be a no calculator problem. I would let you probably use a calculator on this. You got to make sure in your calculator that you put parentheses around these numbers to let your calculator know to add them all up first before you divide by 5. Remember, from chapter 1, we have a fraction bar here. You got to treat the fraction bar in a special way. Do everything in the numerator first. So add all these together. That's negative 150. and then divide by 5 at the end. Okay? Again, the mean daily temperature here would be negative 30. Mean stands for average. One last thing, I'm not going to read this whole chart to you, but this little chart reviews whether you get positive, negative answers when you add, subtract, multiply, divide. We've already covered all that in each individual lesson, but I thought this is a good chart that you could use to review and summarize when these things happen, so I just wanted to bring that chart to your attention. Okay? I'm going to stop the video here. If you have questions, make sure you ask during class.